Okay, this is a brief audio review of Chapter 5, Theories of Social Behavior, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So, before we talk about Charlotte Perkins Gilman and her specific theories, we have to really talk about the women's suffrage movement, and this is going to kind of help the context of what she's saying. So, what's interesting about women's suffrage, or the idea that women should gain the right to vote, is that they first had to lose the right to vote before they gained it. Meaning, until suffrage was expressly outlawed, unmarried women who owned property were allowed to vote. They were just very rare. So long before American women gained the right to vote, they actually lost it. Some of the first suffrage laws passed in this country stripped women of a right that they had previously held. And so that kind of goes against our perceptions of how these things worked. And I really do resent the narrative that we promoted in society that women gained the right to vote, that they were given the right to vote. This idea that somehow one day patriarchal society was just like, hey, you know what? Those women, we should give them a right to vote, right? It actually came from a very strong, sustained campaign to win those rights, right? To kind of change hearts and minds. And actually, some interesting, if you know a little bit about the history, some interesting associations with the Anti-Saloon League and other organizations because of the assumption that women would vote to create prohibition, and then prohibition just went into effect before women got the right to vote anyway. So it's just an interesting historical tidbit. So gender inequality is a big part of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's interest, especially within the United States. And this is just the unequal treatment or perceptions of individuals based on their gender. And the road to combating gender inequality in the U.S., or the disparities that exist in status, power, prestige, between those who identify as women and those who identify as men, has been a long, arduous process. And of course, it's not over. It's not like, well, we did it. We had our Me Too movement, and now it's all over, right? The book used the example of FIFA and the pay disparities between men and women's soccer that wasn't remedied until recently. So, that's just one of many examples of how our society is still very gendered and very divided along kind of gendered inequities. So she was, not to mention, the first person we talk about as a sociologist that's a woman. So, hey, eventually we'll get to someone who's not white. But anyway, we'll get there incrementally. So Charlotte was really interesting as a sociologist because she was an accomplished writer, feminist, and even though we consider a sociologist and like the history of sociology, we consider her that, at the time period, she wasn't considered a sociologist by a lot of her kind of male colleagues of the time because she didn't have a fancy degree. And but there's a lot of reasons the book argues for considering her a sociologist anyway. So first was she identified as a sociologist and was identified by others as one. And my favorite one is she taught sociology classes. They're like, she's not a sociologist, she just teaches it. She did decline an academic appointment in sociology, but she was frequently a freelance lecturer on campuses. She wrote sociological books and articles, some of which were published in the influential American Journal of Sociology. And she was a charter member of the American Sociological Society and remained a member for 25 years. American Sociological Society, one of the most tragic acronyms of any sociological society. Oh, figure it out yourself. Okay, so Gilman was also a very pivotal feminist theorist. She was one of the first to seek to explain how women and men came to have respective societal roles. So we're really talking about gender roles way before most folks, and looking at why societies would develop gendered inequalities. Significantly, the three main theoretical traditions from which Gilman drew, which we'll talk about in a minute, were social Darwinism, symbolic interactionism, and Marxist theory, or the offshoots of Marxism. So these are the main traditions around which feminist social theories still revolve today. So a little bit about Charlotte. Her childhood and family. She was born July 3rd, 1860. Her father, Frederick, was part of the distinguished New England Beecher clan. His grandfather was the influential theologian Lyman Beecher, and his uncle was the famous clergyman and abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher, and his aunt was the abolitionist and author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Frederick Beecher Perkins himself was a librarian and a writer of some distinction, but he abandoned the family soon after Charlotte was born. So, although there was a lack of money that prevented Charlotte from receiving much in the way of a formal education, because her dad abandoned them, she attended the Rhode Island School of Design in 1878 to 1879, and the training she received there enabled her to earn money as a commercial artist. A lot of her education was gained through just voracious reading, some of which was overseen by her absentee father. Although he was only a quote-unquote occasional visitor, he would send Charlotte books and catalogs of books, as well as a list of books to read, right? As I, myself, kind of a sociologist and librarian, yeah, that's a weird way to pair it. Be like, here's some books, read those. Anyway, so she had very little interest in the pursuits that were deemed proper for a girl at the time period, right, the 1800s. So she really spurned a lot of the traditional gender roles that were assigned to her as a woman. She refused to play the part of a frail woman. She chose instead to exercise a lot vigorously and develop her own physical strength. She married this guy named Charles Walter Stetson in 1884, and in their first year of marriage, she became increasingly and inexplicably despondent. So she didn't really take to marriage too well, right? It wasn't a positive experience for her. The birth of her daughter, Catherine, just 10 and a half months after her wedding, seemed to make her even more depressed. At the time, the prescribed remedy for women that had melancholia was rest and no intellectual activity, which nearly drove her into madness. And if you've never heard of Charlotte Perkins Gilman for her sociological theories, you've probably heard of her, or maybe you've had to read her book, The Yellow Wallpaper, in a history class or something like that. It's really, really interesting. That's kind of how most people know her. And The Yellow Wallpaper is just very traumatizing if you've read it. Just kind of the idea that you got to rest and even rest your brain because your poor, frail, weak woman brain basically needs the rest or you can't recuperate. And so it's really interesting for her that it's kind of the opposite, right? Having stimulation, having like physical movement, having something to read was actually what can pull her out of that, right? Instead of shoving her in a room where she stares at the yellow wallpaper all day. Right? If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Not a long book, very impactful. So anyway, she almost went crazy. That's where I was. I was like, where was I? And then so she took a trip to California, as we do, and away from her husband and her kid, and she recognized that that's what she needed. She needed to get out and do something and not just be cooped up in a yellow wallpaper room. So in 1890, she decided to separate from her husband and move to California. And she undertook whatever work she could find, lecturing on women's rights and writing for small periodicals and even managing a boarding house. And in 1894, she got divorced. Her ex-husband married her closest friend, so that's not drama. And then Catherine, her daughter, didn't live with her, lived with her husband and the new wife. So, Charlotte Perkins Gilman expanded her lecturing tours and became well known in women's suffrage circles for her provocative ideas about women's rights, as well as other societal issues. And after the publication of Women in Economics, we'll talk about in a minute, her reputation as a feminist was secured. So she was connected to a lot of progressive movements, such as Fabian socialism, which is a brand of socialism that calls for the collective ownership and democratic control of resources. So while advocating equality for all, Fabian socialists rejected the classical Marxist theory of revolutionary class struggle in favor of a more peaceful and gradual social change. So in 1900, at the age of 40, she married George Houghton Gilman, a guy 7 years younger, hello. And then between her second marriage and 1914, she reached the peak of her public activity and fame. She published 9 books, founded the journal Forerunner, and in which she published a bunch of feminist stories and articles. So in 1932, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and on August 17th, 1935, Charlotte Perkins Gilman took her own life, writing in her suicide note that she preferred chloroform to cancer. Damn. So anyway, quite a woman, quite a life, quite a lot more to talk about. So let's get into her intellectual influences and core ideas. So Gilman's theory of gender inequality really drew from a variety of theoretical wells, including Marxism, symbolic interactionism, and social Darwinism. Her multidimensional theory of gender inequality combines a Marxist emphasis on the economic and political basis for gender inequality, from the symbolic interactionist emphasis on how gender differences are reinforced and institutionalized through the process of socialization, or, to symbolic interactionists, when we interact with each other, we make meaning. So in that way, when we interact, we reinforce and we institutionalize gender. And then the last one, which is a little bit very problematic in her theorizing, is a sociobiological emphasis on the evolutionary advantages or roots of gender differences. But again, with any of these theorists, we have to take them within the context of the time period that said that women were actually biologically inferior. So that gives you a little bit of the context. Anyway, okay, so she was interested in the political and economic factors that produce inequality, again, pulling from Marxism. She sought to show that the division of labor of the traditional family, meaning a breadwinner husband, a stay-at-home wife, that this was inherently problematic because it makes women economically dependent on men. Just as Marx considered the system of capitalism inherently exploitive because workers don't own the means of production, Gilman considered the traditional family structure inherently exploitive because the economic compensation of women bears no relation to her labor. Meaning, if you do a good job or a bad job, has no material condition on how much money you have in your household. Regardless of how much work she does or doesn't do, her social and economic standing is only coming from her husband. So her labor belongs to her husband, not to herself. Okay, so looking through the kind of lens of the Chicago School and the symbolic interactionist tradition, Gilman emphasized how differential socialization leads to and sustains gender inequality. She challenged the long-standing assumption that inherent biological differences precluded men and women from effectively pursuing overlapping social activities, right? The kind of idea they called it at the time, separate spheres, right? The idea that the sphere for men was outside the home, like politics, the dog-eat-dog world was too rough and tumble for women, and that the domestic sphere, the sphere of the home, was only for women, and they were somehow biologically better suited for this. So Gilman maintained that from the earliest age, young girls were encouraged, if not forced, to act, think, look, and talk differently from boys, though their interests and capabilities at that age might be identical. Ironically, differential gender socialization is not only evident today as in her time, but even more apparent. So she was definitely ahead of her time at thinking about this stuff. Now here's where it gets interesting. A little bit, the Darwinian stuff gets a little interesting, at least to us in our context of how we understand gender today. So Gilman, again, borrowed from Fabian socialism, the whole thing, but also from social Darwinism, and applying Darwin's theory of evolution to human societies, maintaining that human existence was based on survival of the fittest. Now, let's put a pin in that for 2 seconds. I feel like there's always a misinterpretation of survival of the fittest. When we think about survival of the fittest, it's not the dinosaurs that continued to live, right? It was those tiny little mice and things that could hide. So what's interesting is when you think of the fittest, what did Darwin mean by fittest? He meant most adaptable. The things that could adapt the best are the fittest, not the biggest, the strongest, the kind of way that sometimes people misinterpret it. Okay, side note. So Darwin's theory of evolution, you have folks that then try and apply that to society, right, which is very problematic, and we'll talk more about that later. So Gilman argued that women and men have different biological principles to which they adhere, and she maintained that women's unique capabilities, particularly their love and concern for others, have tremendous social value, though they are grossly underappreciated in a patriarchal society. So here's where it gets fun, and this is where she really was hated a lot by people at the time period. She went so far to assert the natural superiority of females, right? Because again, this is a time period where men basically say they are superior to women, and they use that as a basis to kind of control a lot of status and power within Western society at the time period. So she enthusiastically endorsed the quote-unquote scientifically based gynocentric theory promoted by sociologist Lester Ward, suggesting that the civilizing capacities of women could compensate for the destructive combativeness of men. So Gilman maintained that in contrast to men, women didn't want to fight, they didn't want to take or oppress, they wanted to love. The women exhibited the growing altruism of work founded in mother love, in the anti-selfish instinct of reproduction. That's her quote, because it sounds weird. That's her quote. I didn't say that. So Gilman's view of women as saintly givers and men as warring beasts is incredibly problematic, right? She glorifies the female instincts of love and service, yet her radical feminist theory dissolves into the sentimental worship of the status quo. Her insistence on the giving nature of women as compared to the combative nature of men seems to indicate that women must be and should be the primary caretakers of children, and that there are only so far that a man can go in his role as a nurturer. So her biological determinism that she's arguing here seems very antiquated by our understandings today. And many contemporary fathers are far more nurturing towards their children than were their fathers or their grandfathers, though they have the same basic biological constitution. So clearly it's not biology, it's society, right? But what's so interesting about this whole thing, and we'll get to it in a minute, is she literally didn't raise her child. Like, she literally kind of abandoned her kid. And her kid was being raised by her best friend. So this idea that, like, well, women just inherently love, they're more loving, they're more nurturing, and you're like, are they? Are you? But anyway, sorry, side note. Okay, so this is part of that higher sensitivity. Basically, you know, some research has tried to look at this and say that women might be more sensitive than men when it comes to certain, you know, touch, sound, smell, things like this. And they talk about that a bit in the book. And then, you know, contemporary neurological research really looks at the interconnectedness of nature v. nurture. There's always this idea that it's one or the other, right? Nature and nurture get into a cage match, you know, two enter, one leaves. But as you see in the kind of additional resources, that video on epigenetics, it's actually both, right? Researchers are really interested in the ways in which it's both. It's your biology, but it's also the environment in which you live, meaning our genes are not our destiny. They do provide certain characteristics to us, but then there's also ways in which our lifestyle or the environment we live in can either turn on or turn off certain genes that can actually impact us in many ways. Okay, moving on to drawing the biological arguments about race. Whoo, here she goes again. Drawing not only on social Darwinist theories of survival of the fittest, but also on the common sense notions of manifest destiny and the white man's burden that were dominant in her day, she made patently racist remarks, you know, things today that would be like, yikes, Charlotte. And another thing she did beyond just, you know, kind of buying into the racist hype of the time period was also when she talks about women, she really is only kind of explicitly or she really only means white women, right? She's not considering or discussing the resources or situations of women who aren't white. And her discussions of the isolation of traditional housewives completely ignored the fact that African American women may not have had the same traditions of support and community, you know, that the white women did, meaning maybe they did actually have more support in those situations. Maybe, you know, again, because she was looking through her own privileged lens, she wasn't really thinking about how, you know, when she talks about women as a category, she really only means white women. And though ironically, she did decry slavery and oppression, she spoke out against slavery and the continued oppression of African Americans, and she spoke out against the genocide and the ill treatment of Native Americans, and of course Native Hawaiians at that time period, before that was Hawaii was completely colonized and turned into a state. So she's a mixed bag when it comes to reading her within the future. Okay, looking at her theoretical orientation, Gilman's most concerned about the structural institutional basis of gender inequality. So she's situated in the more rational collective end of the theoretical continuum. And given that she's putting like three different approaches together, neo-Marxism, symbolic interactionism, and Darwinism, she can be seen as theoretically multidimensional. Let's see what else. As far as the individual level, she has a kind of non-rational orientation. Because she's emphasizing the institutional barriers to gender inequality, she highlights the differential gender socialization as well as distinct sex principles. And these concerns reflect a non-rational orientation to action primarily at the individual level. But she also took a rationalist approach to political and economic structures, which would obviously prohibit women from economic independence. So in that way, she had, at a collective level, kind of a rational approach. Ooh, the metaphor of the corsets is a real fun one. So basically, Gilman's emphasis on the collective structural basis of inequality, which is, apparent in her passage on women's corsets, can be considered a metaphor for the general constraints placed on women. And the metaphor of the corset reflects this constraint that originates outside of a woman. It's an external pressure, which, is kind of pointing towards rationalism. And very similar to the notion of Marx's false consciousness, which we'll talk about in a minute. She also was interested in indoctrination, which is non-rationalist, basically the way you internalize the pressures of society, that women are so indoctrinated that they then resist their own liberation or their own freedom. So in the case of the corset, right, the inequality is there, but if you don't see it, then you don't know that it's happening. And so if you've internalized the pressure and constraints of society as your own, like instead of saying, oh, they think I should be this kind of woman, you instead say, I think I should be this kind of woman. That's really looking at the more non-rationalist theoretical position. And then this resistance to a true consciousness. Gilman was acknowledging that women might be resistant to kind of breaking free from gender role ideology because of the safety and familiarity that's provided by that false consciousness. So she argued that women not only accept, but also believe in the legitimacy of the traditional division of labor. So it's no surprise that they feel discomforted by any other reality, right? So even though you're saying, no, you deserve more power, more this, more that, it's that whole idea, the devil you know, right? That some people are going to push back against those things because they have power and privilege in some ways in the position that they have, or they kind of fear the change or the unknown of how those things would change. Okay, continuing on here. In terms of order, Gilman acknowledges that social patterns exist prior to an individual, meaning the traditional gendered division of labor is a long-established social structure. You're basically born into a gendered society. So she emphasizes that it's individual interactions that actually continues gender inequality. So while it's a social structure you can be born into, it's the day-to-day life that kind of informs those interactions that continues to make gender a problem. Meaning we can accept gender roles and just be indoctrinated, or we can resist them. And this is a big deal, what she's talking about here. This is theories that people didn't talk about for a long time after. So we can push back against those things through our interactions with others. So it's difficult to stand up against social hierarchies. So Gilman says it takes an advanced individual to see through the taken for granted symbolic codes that legitimate social hierarchies and oppression. Meaning, again, if you're socialized from when you're born to think that men are better than women, it wouldn't be surprising that you'd hold some of those viewpoints. Okay, another thing she did that really really pissed people off was challenging the core family value notion. This, idea that she was basically seen as, well, how can you speak on what it is to be a woman because you left your husband, you left your child. She was publicly skewered for, kind of going out there and talking about these lofty feminist beliefs and kind of, isolated in a lot of ways because it really went against the expected roles for women at the time. She did have some problematic assumptions on social change. She thought it rested entirely at the level of the individual, which is very problematic because social change can also be, larger and institutional. She did not recognize that it was not solely individual free will or social advancement that would help people, throw off their corsets. Also, while she understood that being a woman was like being in a corset, she failed to acknowledge that there might be other corsets, right? Again, racism, homophobia, etc. Like there was other things that were also constraining people in a kind of very similar way. And so all individuals are affected by their environment, not just those that are advanced, right? Social change can arise when people begin to see their lives in a new way. And so this process occurs not just because of revelations at the level of the individual, but because of new social and cultural conditions. The virtue of social theorists and intellectuals and social activists is they can produce and disseminate new ideas and symbolic schemes that then potentially can lead to social change, right? She goes out, she writes this stuff, she changed people's ideas, and boom, social change. So it's not just that this one individual says, I'm not going to do that anymore. Right? It's kind of that change happens in multi-dimensional ways. Okay, let's get a little bit more specific into some of the stuff she wrote. Women in Economics is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's most sociological as well as most theoretical work of nonfiction. In the book, she says the traditional division of labor is inherently problematic, right? As we talked about a second ago, breadwinner, husband, stay-at-home wife. And she maintains the traditional division of labor renders women economically dependent on men and strips women of their freedom. So economic independence is when there's a direct relationship between one's labor and one's compensation for the labor. And the problem with the traditional division of labor was that women received their economic viability and their social status through their husbands only. So she argued that this isn't biologically driven. There's no reason that women can't work or have status of their own. She said that women's economic dependency makes them more akin to a horse than an equal partner in a traditional marriage. She has a fun read. Anyway, so she says the problem with women's economic dependence on men is that their energies become focused on catching a man rather than being a productive citizen. So in denying her capability, she reduces herself to being literally the weaker sex. So she also talks a lot about the ideas of sex distinction. So primary sex distinctions are differences in structures and functions essential to reproduction. So primary sex distinctions would be like your sexual organs, or can you produce milk to feed a child, stuff like that. Secondary sex distinctions are modifications of structure and function, such as sexual competition and sexual attraction, that serve reproduction but are not directly essential to reproduction themselves. So Gilman argues that in humans, these have become an excessive sex distinctions, that differences in structure and function have been taken to such a degree that they're dysfunctional for the human species. So she said that women, especially middle and upper class women, were encouraged not to use but to deny their talents and capabilities. So this is what she calls the socio-biological tragedy, that women are not underdeveloped men, but the feminine half of humanity in an undeveloped form. She says women are oversexed. There's too much emphasis on their sex distinctions, rather than a healthy survival of the fittest in which women would be taught to be strong and productive. Bourgeois women were maintained to be soft and weak, dependent, emotional, and frail. So Gilman suggests that just as the proletariat are exploited by the bourgeoisie, so too are women exploited by men. Okay, despite significant institutional advances in education and professional opportunities, legal rights, and other, spheres, some of the social and cultural gender inequities that Gilman was talking about are still happening today, meaning women are still oversexed. Like, look at the plastic surgery industry, or the Kardashians, right, or any of that. Women still lack basic legal and civil rights. in addition to enduring major cultural and social inequality in many contemporary societies. Women recently, again, lost bodily autonomy with the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the conservative stacked Supreme Court. So clearly, much work still needs to be done to ensure that women are entitled to the same legal and social rights that men have enjoyed for decades, if not centuries. So it's interesting to see how a thinker like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, from the time period she was at, and even with the somewhat limitations of the theory because of, the isms of the time period, she really did, push through and kind of create a foundation for an important realm of feminist theory that could then be critical of patriarchal society. So she's still a very important thinker for us to lean on. Okay, I think that's it for this one. Thanks for sticking with me.